Well, Peter Clark is an international trade expert, president of the firm Gray, Clark & Sheehan Associates. He's a former Canadian trade negotiator and is with me now in our studios. Peter, good to see you again. I know you've followed this back and forth for as long as it's been happening here on negotiations for a new NAFTA. We have something different now. We have something with a new name, but I want to get sort of a reality check from you on what we really have before us here on how did Canada do. Is this the win-win-win scenario that Justin Trudeau talked about, said Canada wanted at the end of the day?
Well, you have to look at it in the context of short-term, immediate, and long-term.
Okay.
This is a good long-term deal for us. What we've had to do because of pressures from the United States, irrational approaches from the United States, is we've had to pay to maintain the status quo. Nobody ever likes to do that,
right?
But reality is reality.
Okay, so is this, the Prime Minister repeatedly said he wouldn't be bound by a U.S. deadline, that he'd walk away from a bad deal because no deal was better than a bad deal. How would you characterize this deal? What did Canada end up with?
Well, Canada ended up paying in dairy. It ended up giving the United States certain rights to intervene in our regulatory processes, which, as a Canadian, bothers me. But when you look at the reality of the long term, the United States could have canceled that agreement on 6 months' notice, NAFTA, and we were concerned that they would. Mm-hmm. So to some extent, it's a salvage operation. To some extent, it's modernizing the agreement and dealing with the future. You lose on one thing and you gain on another. We certainly didn't get hurt on automotive.
Right. Yeah. Let's get into some of the details on that. Yeah. The U.S. President said today, you know, when he was asked what's the biggest concession you made to Canada, he said, I let them keep the deal.
That's absolutely right.
What's the significance of that?
That's the truest thing I've heard him say since he was elected.
And what does it mean? It's basically the deal's legs.
He could have canceled,
right?
And he didn't.
Right. And so we're left with this new arrangement that has a new name. But I mean, let me ask you, what did Canada get? I mean, was the exercise for Canada at the end of the day basically hanging on to what we had?
In part, hanging on to what we had. We didn't get what we wanted to get on government procurement. We didn't get what we wanted.
They're still Buy America.
Yeah, still Buy America. We didn't get what we wanted to get on gender equality. It's not mentioned in the agreement. Culture's there, mm-hmm. and basically the same as it was before. Chapter 19 is there, which keeps people in the softwood lumber business and in British Columbia happy. It doesn't really, in my view, offset what we had to pay in terms of access for dairy, limitations on our exports of dairy, and letting the United States government determine how we can market our milk domestically.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a bit about that on supply management. We've given up another 3.6% of the dairy market to the United States, but we're also giving up to the U.S. Access, doubling the access to the chicken industry, eggs and poultry, than we were prepared to give the U.S. under the TPP. So we've gone further under this agreement. I mean, how big of an impact do you think that'll have on Canadian farmers?
Well, it has an immediate impact. We have to see how it works out going down the road. There will be some farmers there just won't be enough market for them, and they'll go out of business. Mm-hmm. And that's a sad thing, because what we're doing is we're affecting Canadian farmers who limit their production to get rid of gluts that are caused by Americans who don't.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the big problem, is that on the American side is they're also subsidized, but there's really no constraints on production, so they have way too much product.
Well, they can't really meet their production costs from the market, so it's a crazy situation. You're losing money, so you produce more and more, and then the government eventually picks it up and takes it off the market, or gives them subsidies for insurance. But Canadian farmers, supply managed farmers, don't get that.
All right. This is supposed to be a free trade deal, and yet, as you touched on, the deal doesn't eliminate those tariffs on steel and aluminum. What's going to happen there?
It's a managed trade deal. Bob Lighthizer likes managed trade. That's the way he ran his career. He was trying to manage steel imports. When he was involved in the government, he had set up these voluntary export restraints on steel. So it's becoming much more managed and predictable trading environment, similar to what we try to do with supply management, but not for other products. It's much more difficult.
So what's hanging over us on the tariff front then? I mean, we're not free of the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum. They've made some changes in auto by looking at the volume of Canadian product going into the U.S., setting that a little higher. Will that allow Canada to escape tariffs on auto for sure?
Well, it's interesting because if you go through the exclusions chapter, you'll find that there's a new heading called Essential Security Interests, which is basically what they've been doing on steel, aluminum, and threatening to do on cars.
Right.
So the provision is still there. We have a side letter that says in automobiles we can export 2.6 million, which is about 25% higher or more than we've been traditionally exporting, and then another $32 million US in parts.
The logic there is that by setting the volume higher, that Canada would have to go some distance to reach that volume before it would be subject to a tariff.
Well, you know, where production is decided in Japan, it's decided in Detroit. We don't decide it in Canada.
Right.
So there's not going to be much difference on that. But what it does is it lets Trump look good, saying, look what I've done. I've put controls on cars from NAFTA, pointing at Mexico. But where Mexico has a same type of access, but it doesn't really affect us. Now, those deals are illegal under the WTO, but they're consenting adults agreements, and if nobody complains, nothing's going to happen.
Okay. What do you think happens next? Of course, the deal has to be subject to, on the U.S. side, subject to approval by Congress. Will they get it?
Depends when they go up to get it. Congress had meetings with Lighthizer this week, and they said they're not really going to be ready to look at it until February or March next year. It's quite possible that Congress might not like the deal. Now, Lighthizer's tried to set it up so they would. I mean, it is attractive, particularly in the optics for Americans. But they could pretty well, if the Democrats have the majority next year, and it's been a bitter midterm election, they might just decide, no, we're not going to put this up, we're not going to pass it. Trump killed what they would claim was a better deal in the TPP and denied Obama his legacy, so we're going to deny him his. It's pretty, he admitted when he was being interviewed this morning, no guarantees.
Right. Okay, so at the end of the day, is this as good as Canada could have done?
In defending its interests in the environment, the United States had certain things it wanted. They got them. Canada limited the damage. They salvaged as much as they could of NAFTA. And what you're looking at now, trade agreements aren't like quarterly reports from corporations. They don't have to make their numbers every quarter.
Right.
What you're doing is looking at the long term. In the long term, it's good.
And according to the rules of this agreement now, it's good for, it's a 16-year deal that gets reviewed after year 6, as I understand it. And then they have, if there's problems, they have that 10-year window to 16 to try and solve them before anybody pulls the plug.
Yeah, we've had problems before with NAFTA, and they usually get resolved by ministers talking to each other once a year.
Right.
It's not that big a concern. It was just the concern about it having a drop dead date at 5 years. It kills investment.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's more certainty built into this.
Yes.
All right. Peter Clark, it's always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks, Peter.